Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, The Road to Net Zero, How EU, ETS and FuelEU Maritime are reshaping the industry. My name is Chris Wright, and I'm delighted to be hosting the session on behalf of AlphaShip Academy. At AlphaShip, we're committed to providing industry professionals with the latest insights on regulatory developments and operational challenges in the maritime sector. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing effort to support shipping communities in navigating complex and evolving regulatory landscapes. Currently, the shipping industry is at a turning point, with EU emissions trading systems, or EU ETS, now covering maritime emissions, and the FuelEU Maritime regulation set to accelerate transitions to cleaner fuels. Ship owners and operators must quickly adapt to remain compliant and competitive. To help us better understand these changes, we are honored to be joined by Marina Ronda San José. Marina holds an MSc in Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering, with specialized studies in the decarbonization of the shipping sector. Since joining the Spanish Shipowners Association, ANAVE, she's worked closely with national and European administrations on the development of these regulations. Currently, she supports Spanish shipping companies in the practical implementations of these new rules. ANAVE also follows global regulatory advancements from the International Maritime Organization, ensuring the industry stays informed and prepared. With that brief introduction, I'd like to welcome Marina, who's going to guide us through the key implementations of these regulations and how they're going to reshape the future of shipping. Hi, Marina.
Hello, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. We're looking forward today to learning more about these interesting regulations and how they're going to affect the industry.
Me too, indeed.
So I believe you have a presentation prepared. If you'd like to share your screen, we can begin.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, can you see my screen?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay. So thank you, AlphaShip, for having me today here, and thank you, Chris, of course. I work as a maritime policy advisor in the Spanish Shipowners Association. The members of ANAVE operate 99% of the fleet controlled by Spanish ship owners, which is not bad. We have a high representativeness of the sector, and with that, we have some perspective on the implications of these regulations in the shipping industry. Today, we're going to be talking about the basis of the inclusion of shipping in the EU ETS, as well as in the application of FuelEU Maritime. Then we will look into a comparison of both regulations, because there are some differences that still today cause some confusion. Then we will have a look into an economic impact on the Spanish control fleet, and we will make some final reflections. Well, first of all, Fit for 55 is an European legislative package that contains different initiatives with the objective to reduce the EU greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% in 2030. There are some regulations in this package affecting the shipping industry, such as, for example, the Energy Taxation Directive, which proposes a minimum tax on the bunker fuels used on board ships, depending on their energy content, and also to the electricity supplied on board ships. Then the next one, we have the AFIR, which sets a number of national targets for the deployment of alternative fuels infrastructure on shore, including ports. And then we have the hot topics of the industry today, which are EU ETS and FuelEU Maritime, which are the subject of this webinar. And these are the ones that have a direct and economic impact today. So starting off with the European Union Emission Trading System, or as commonly known, the EU ETS. What we need to have in mind is that the basis of both ETS and FuelEU is the MRV regulation. Since 2018, the maritime shipping companies, the shipping companies are monitoring, verifying, and reporting their emissions in the platform called the MRV, in accordance with this MRV regulation. However, since the 1st of January of 2024, the shipping companies also need to purchase and surrender allowances per each ton of emissions reported. This slide is a summary of the scope of MRV and ETS. In color blue, it is highlighted the cells that are under the scope of MRV. Well, the categories of ships and emissions that are under the scope of MRV. And in orange, it is highlighted the categories that are also included in ETS. So for the first block of rows, we can see that until 2023, cargo passenger ships over 5,000 GTs were monitoring their emissions, as we previously said, since 2018, okay? But from last year, from the 1st of January of 2024, they are also included in the EU ETS system. This means that this year, in September of 2025, they will have to surrender for the first time allowances for the emissions of 2024. Now we can see that offshore ships and also general cargo ships between 400 and 5,000 GTs, since this year, are also starting to monitor their emissions. And you can see that for offshore ships above 5,000 GTs, they will also be under the scope of ETS as of 2027. We can see here that the application of MRV is the first step towards the inclusion of ETS. Although it is true that for offshore and general cargo ships between 400 and 5,000 GTs, it is yet to be determined whether they will be into the scope of ETS, and it will be decided in the 2026 ETS review. But for the moment, they are monitoring their emissions. Now, in the second block, you can see which type of emissions are covered. Until last year, shipping companies were monitoring the emissions of CO2. But since 2024, they are also monitoring the methane and nitrous oxide emissions. Well, in fact, in 5 days, shipping companies must submit their emission reports, and for the first time, these reports are covering the methane and nitrous oxide emissions. So we will see. And finally, the final block shows the gradual implementation of EU ETS, which is the percentage of emissions for which they will have to surrender allowances. It may seem a little bit complicated, but if you stop a little bit and see this slide slower, you will see that it is all very clearly stated. Regarding the geographical scope, the ETS is applied in regards of 100% of the emissions within EU ports, also 100% of the emissions from intra-EU voyages, which are the voyages that starts and ends in a European port of call, as we can see in the presentation. And finally, it applies to 50% of the emissions from extra-EU voyages, which are the voyages that starts or ends in a European port of call and are connected to a port that is in a third country. Now, I have decided to include this slide that talks a little bit, talks in depth about the definition of port of call, because this concept is really important in these regulations. The definition of port of call establishes where a voyage starts and where it ends. Actually, in the last years, we have had a lot of questions from our members, especially at the beginning, that this concept was not so clear. And they were asking for different combination of stops in different ports to determine how these scales will impact on the allowances they will have to surrender at the end of the year. So so the regulation defines the port of call as the port where a ship stops to load or unload cargo, or to embark or disembark passengers. Then also there are some stops that do not qualify as port of calls. But what I would like to emphasize here is that these exclusions of the definitions doesn't mean that you will not be surrendering allowances for the emissions released in this port of calls. Instead, it means that if a stop is not a port of call, then this stop will be part of the voyage between the previous port of call and the following one. Okay, I know this can be a little bit overwhelming, but I'm going to show you some examples. To name a few, for example, they exclude stops for the sole purposes of refueling, going into dry dock, or the very famous stop of container ships in the neighboring container transshipment ports, which are at the moment Hermet and East Portside. For example, in this case, we have a ship that has a load that is loading cargo in Algeciras, Spain, and then we unload cargo in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. As we have just seen, loading and unloading cargo is a port of call. So in this case, it is very clear that the voyage starts in Algeciras and ends in Rotterdam. And since they are both European ports, you will have to surrender emissions for the total amount. You will have to surrender allowances for the total amount of the emissions released. Then let's see this case. We have a ship that has loaded cargo in Rotterdam. Now he stopped in Las Palmas to refuel, and then he will go to Cartagena in Colombia to unload cargo. As we previously saw, Rotterdam and Cartagena, they are port of calls because they are loading and unloading cargo. However, what about Las Palmas? If we go to the previous slide, we can see that stops for the sole purposes of refueling are not port of calls. So with this, it is clear that Las Palmas is not a port of call. It means that the voyage starts in Rotterdam, but does not end in Las Palmas. Instead, it is going to end in Cartagena. So you will have to surrender allowances for 50% of the emissions, because Rotterdam is a European port and Cartagena is not. So now let's go to the FuelEU Maritime. This regulation has two objectives. The first one is reducing the greenhouse gases intensity of the energy used on board ships. And the second one is for container ships and passenger ships to connect to the electric power in port from 2030. In regard of the first objective, which is limiting the GHG intensity, here we have a slide that again shows the scope, and it is not exactly the same as in ETS. In this case, we are speaking about energy instead of emissions. And then I would like to highlight that there is one case that is very different from ETS. In this case, fuel ETS applies to 50% of the energy on intra-EU voyages that are connected to an outermost region of a member state. I would like to emphasize here that this is a permanent exclusion of the outmost region because it's in the scope, it is defined in the scope of FuelEU. But later on, we will see some other exemptions that I'm going to be talking about, which are temporary. In this case, we are defining the voyages just the same as we are doing for ETS, depending on the definition of port of call, which is the same for both regulations. Now, to comply with this regulation, there are different ways of complying with this regulation. The first one is not exceeding the GHG intensity limit established in the regulation. This limit is going to get more stricter every 5 years, and with a significant step in 2040. The steps from 2040 will be higher. This regulation is not a new concept. It's nothing new because today it is the same concept that is applied to road transportation. When you go with your car to a gas station, you can be fueling your car tank, the tank of your car with some fuels that may have a percentage of biofuels or renewable fuels, and this also comes from a European regulation. So this is not new. However, the difference is that in the shipping sector, there are a wider range of mix of fuels that can be used on board ships. And the most important thing is that it is not known in which ports these kind of fuels will be available. So that is why in this specific regulation for shipping, they allow you to comply with not only with the first option, which is complying with the limit, but also with some flexibility mechanisms, which are, first of all, if you have a surplus, a compliance surplus, because you decided to use renewable fuels in one of your ships, you can keep this surplus and use it for the same ship for another year. Also, if you have this compliance surplus, you can pool it with other ships. Or in case you have a deficiency, you could pool with ships that have a surplus compliance, and in this way, you balance out the deficiency. And finally, we have the option to pay the FuelEU penalty. And the thing that you need to have in mind here is that this penalty is multiplied by 10% for each consecutive year that it is paid. So you will not be paying with the same, the penalty will increase at 10% every year that you are paying for this. So what can be done to reduce the average GHG intensity of a ship? The clear option is to use low carbon and renewable fuels, but not all renewable fuels are valid. The criteria in FuelEU is more strict than in the ETS, because in the ETS you need to comply only with the sustainable saving criteria, which is the same as for FuelEU. But in the case of FuelEU, you cannot use, you can use biofuels produced from food and feed crops, but you will not get any better. They will be treated as if they were fossil fuels, so you are not gaining any better. And then another way of reducing your GHG intensity limit is consuming electricity that has been supplied by an onshore power supply import. Why? Well, because this electricity does not release any greenhouse gas emission. So in this numerator, you're not growing anymore. You're just maintaining the same number. And on the other hand, this energy, the electricity energy used, it does contribute as part of the energy on board the ship. So you are growing the denominator. So this is another way. Well, speaking more of the renewable fuels, they must be certified. Renewable fuels must be certified. Once they are certified, you can use the actual emission factor of these fuels instead of the default ones given in the regulations, which usually are higher. Then, for the case of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, they have a rewarding factor of 2 until December 2033. And finally, all energy coming from these alternative fuels can be allocated in the half of the international voyage that is within the scope. Okay, in cases of extra EU voyages, in which I recall you are only accounting for 50% of the energy used on board, you can use the energy that you are using from renewable fuels and allocate it in the part within a scope. Now we're going to evaluate when you are evaluating the best way of compliance in FuelEU ETS, because as we just seen that there are a lot of multiple options of compliance. You will be evaluating mainly 3 factors, okay? The first one is you can decide to just use renewable fuels. So in this case, you will be looking at the price of these fuels. The second option is keep on burning fossil fuels, but you will need to add the cost of the penalty and also the cost of the allowances you are paying for. And finally, you have the option of pooling, as I said before. In this case, the price will be determined based on a private agreement, so it depends on each case. Here, I would like to show you an example. Let me know, can you see this new screen?
Yeah, we can see it, Marina. That's fine.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, this is a calculator that we have prepared in ANAVE for our members. I'm going to explain a little bit because there are a lot of cells, I know. Okay, here, the orange cells, you can introduce the fuels you have been using during the year. For example, you could have been using 10,000 tons of low fuel oil. In this case, your penalty for FuelEU will be this year almost 540 euros. Then, as we saw earlier, in 2030, there is an increasement on the GHG limit, so you will have to pay more, as you can see. In 2035, even more. In 2040, the big step is going to be almost 8,000, and so on, okay? Here you can see if you have the deficit or surplus of compliance for pooling. And then it says, it also indicates the allowances you must surrender, and depending on the price, which is set here, let's say 73, which was the price last Friday, it will give you the amount you need to pay for allowances. You need to have in mind that this price is very volatile, so you should be constantly checking. And I would like, okay, so for example, instead of 10,000, if we say 9,600 of low fuel oil, which we still don't comply, but let's add 400 of biofuel, which is up to 4% of what you used during the year, okay? It's just a 4%. And now you can see that you will be compliance, and not only compliance, but you will also have a surplus that you can pull. So you have the option of gaining some money. Now, what I find very interesting is that if we say, okay, what about if I use 1 ton, only 1 ton of heavy fuel oil? Now this gives you, this is the extra cost that you will be paying for 1 ton, per each ton of heavy fuel oil. 62 euros from 2025 to 2029, 156, then it goes higher. And here we have the amount for allowances, again, for the price that was last Friday, for the price of allowances last Friday. I have made a graph. Let me go back here. Okay, so what I just showed you, if we represent it in a graph, we have the annual extra cost per ton of fossil fuel due to the FuelEU and EU ETS. At the beginning, we can see in the first years that ETS is going to be more, it's going to suppose more cost, but at the end, you will see that FuelEU is going to be the main one. Again, this is an example that I did with the calculator. We didn't take into consideration the 10% addition into the FuelEU penalty that I told you about before, in the case of paying the penalty more than 1 consecutive year. And so this is how you will determine or evaluate which option you will decide to comply with fuel ETS. Now we have the second objective of the regulation, which is connection to onshore power supply. It applies to container ships and passenger ships above 5,000 GTs from 2030 in EU ports within the trans-European networks, and from 2035 for all European ports equipped with the facilities. And in between these periods, it is up to member states if they extend it to all the European ports. And also they will have to decide if they are extending this obligation to ships at anchorage or in another part of the port. The connection, the obligation of connecting to OPS have some exceptions that I have listed in the slide, such as, for example, ships that are going to be for short stays, less than 2 hours moored at the port, or also when it is used as zero emission technology instead of OPS. In Annex 3, you can see, you can take a exhaustive list of different technologies that are considered as zero emission technologies, and the rest of exceptions are listed, like safety reasons, tests, and other things. Now, well, although both regulations are European, also have the same objective, and they have been developed practically at the same time and are applied in the same period of time. There are a lot of inconsistencies between them, which at the end, it just makes life harder for ship owners, administrations, the verifiers, and all of us. So I think it is worth it to look into this. Okay, first of all, there are exceptions. There are some ships for certain voyages that are exempted to both surrender allowances for their emissions, and also that are out of the scope of the FuelEU Maritime. The exemptions are a very complicated topic because even though they may seem very similar at first sight, there are a lot of details that are applied differently. In fact, I have, well, you can see the comparison between these two. I'm not going to analyze it in full depth because we will need another 30 minutes to go into very detail. But the important thing here is to know that which are the exceptions in this case for small island and public service obligations. In the case of EU ETS, it is applied until the end of 2030 for ferry and RoPax ships, whereas in FuelEU it is applied until the end of 2029 and only for ferries. Okay, and this applies to voyages between small islands and ports located in the same member state. In one of the regulation, Ceuta and Melilla are not considered under these exemptions. In FuelEU, Ceuta and Melilla are exempted. So this is to be looking at it more slow, okay? Then we have other exemptions regarding the outermost regions, such as, for example, in the case of Spain, the Canary Islands. Again, we have some differences. As I told you at the beginning, the scope of FuelEU Maritime sets a permanent exemption for 50% of the voyages connected to an outermost region of a member state. So in principle, it's going to be permanent. It is permanent. But also, they establish a temporary exemption, a different one, instead of for 50% of the energy for the total energy used when in a voyage connected to an outermost region. But again, it is temporary. Then there are other exemptions that affect to ice class vessels, again, very different with some differences between these two regulations. And now we have another difference. In this case, it is not about the exemptions, it is about the responsible entity of compliance. Okay, so how do you explain? Okay. It seems reasonable that the responsible entity were the time charter of the ship because they decide the route, the cargo that is transported, the fuel, the speed of the ship, and at the end, it is the one who has the possibility to reduce the economic impact. However, in these types of European rules, the European Commission has a tendency to point out to either the registered owner or the ISMN company because there is only one per ship. In the case, again, between these two regulations, there are some differences. In the case of EU ETS, the responsible of compliance can be either the registered owner or the ISMN company. And in the case of FuelEU, it is only the ISMN company. And this has consequences mostly regarding administrative burden. And now some differences that I find quite interesting in both regulations regarding renewable fuels. In both of the regulations, as I mentioned before, they need to meet the sustainability saving criteria, which is set in another regulation called the Renewable Energy Directive, or the RED III. In both regulations, they need to be certified. And once they are certified, you can use the actual emission factor of these fuels instead of the default ones established in the regulation. And then the biggest difference is that ETS ETS is more strict in the sense that you can't allocate the complete emissions, that you can allocate the complete renewable fuels used in half of the international voyages that are within the scope. I mean, in cases where you are in international voyages, you cannot decide to use these renewable fuels in the half of the voyage that is going to be accounted when calculating your emissions. However, in FuelEU, you can do this. It is more permissible in this sense. And then, on the other hand, the FuelEU is more permissible, more flexible in the sense of that for these renewable fuels, once they are certified, you can consider, it is allowed to consider as if they didn't release any emissions. So you can use an emission factor for CO2 only of 0. However, in FuelEU, this is not allowed. You need to use the actual emission factor of the ship. There are other differences regarding the reimbursement of costs. If you remember, I said previously in the responsible for compliance that it would make sense to for the charters to be the responsible of compliance because they are the ones that that has some deciding on the economic impact of the ship. So in the case of EU ETS, it is allowed, well, it is established a right for the responsible entity to be reimbursed for the costs of the allowances. But in the case of ETS, this is not the case. And then there are other small differences between regarding the monitoring of the fuel consumed according to MRV. Now, I would like to have some time to speak about the economic impact. We have made some estimations based on the emissions data that we had on CO2 emissions from the fleet controlled by Spanish shipping companies, only Spanish shipping companies. As I said previously, this year, in 5 days, it's going to be the first time that shipping companies must submit their emissions reports covering methane and nitrous oxide gases. So until this moment, we haven't had this data and it is still not available. So that's why this estimation has been done only with CO2 emissions. But I find it very interesting because you can see here for different types of ships, what is going to be the estimation, the average annual cost per ship due to these regulations, and the average is going to be 1.5 million euros of annual extra cost per ship. So it means that by 2030, a total of 1.0 billion euros will be collected by the Spanish administration from Spanish shipping companies. Now, to conclude this webinar, I would like to make some reflections with you. Well, at the end, these regulations, what will imply? They will have some consequences in the European industry. They will have the most great impact in the European industry because at the end they will make the exports more expensive and ultimately will lead to a loss of competitiveness of this European industry. Of course, as you can imagine, it will affect to the European ports as well, because there is a risk of recollocation of the ship scales. I would like to highlight that these regulations address only 0.3% of the global GHG emissions. So we'll see if the consequences are worth it. But this is not me to decide, of course, not neither of us. Okay, so the industry objective is to align with the IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization framework, approach. For this, it will be very important the next meeting of the Marine Environment Protection Committee of the IMO in April 2025, because at the moment they are considering developing an economic measure very similar to the one that we have seen in this webinar. However, China, India, and Brazil are against it. So it will be of high importance this next meeting to know the feelings. The industry is optimism about the prospects of reaching an international framework. And in case it is agreed, then for the revision of the ETS in 2026, the objective will be to align and to pursue the alignment with the international framework. So we all have the same level playing field. And I would like to close with a statement. ETS funds must revert into the sector. This is something that the Commission has already said. The European Commission has announced that 20 million allowances, which is around, at the cost of today's allowances, is around 1.6 billion euro, up to until 2030, will be dedicated to specific calls to support the decarbonization of the ships. However, at national level, we would like a compromise, or at least that these funds are reverted to the sector, because according to our estimations, the Spanish shipping companies are planning to invest for the renewal of their fleet, modernization of their fleet, around 1 billion euros by 2030. And also from estimations of UNESCO, we know that ports will need an investment of around 705 million euros by 2030 to prepare for the decarbonization of shipping. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any question, please just let me know. I will be honored to help you.
Thanks, Marina. Really interesting. It was a good presentation. It went into detail on some of the more interesting parts of the regulations. It's a complicated thing to explain in such detail, but I think you did really well. Particularly the spreadsheet where you can see the calculations.
Oh, yes.
It's very clear to see there. You can change the amount of fuel that's being used, and you can see how that's going to affect, how it can be pulled and reduced in the following years. At this point, I've opened the chat. So anyone who wants to take part with any questions, they can write it into the chat and we can ask Marina. But I'll start off with a question. So we know that there's no consensus on which is the best fuel to move forward with for shipping owners. We've been through different things. We thought maybe the LNG was going to be the next major fuel for shipping vessels. Now we've got other fuel sources like methane, hydrogen, and I think probably at the moment people think a mixture of these fuels is going to be the way to move forwards. But from your experience with ship owners in Spain, what's their strategy moving forwards to try and reduce the economic impact of these new regulations?
Well, I would say, the FuelEU Maritime is very recent, as we saw. started applying this year. But as for the investments they are planning to do, right now they are trying very hardly to be more energetically efficiency. So it allows you to reduce the total emissions. Well, it allows you to reduce your fuel consumption, and ultimately it leads to a reduction of the allowances you need to surrender. On the other hand, for FuelEU, they're actually considering, the vast majority is actually considering biofuels and renewable fuels. Right now, everyone seems to be moving forward this kind of solution because hydrogen and other ammonia, this kind of fuels, is seen more on the longer term. However, biofuels, and I think the hot topic nowadays is biofuels and renewable fuels in general. This is something that also the fuel suppliers are really working into, even with the shipping companies try to determine what mixes they will be using.
Yeah, yeah, interesting to see how we actually do move forward physically with port installations and which fuels are going to be readily available and where they can be bunkered. We have a question. The question here is, as understood on the slides, container ships do not have exemption ETS and FuelEU when trading in the Canary Islands. Is that correct?
Yes, it is indeed correct. That's very well seen.
It's the first question.
Yes, let me go again. Sorry, I just let's go again here to see it. But you spotted correctly. We don't have the exemptions we have is only for ferries and RoPax ships. Regarding outermost regions, again, I'm sorry. Yes, I was mistaken. Yes, for all types of ships. Sorry, I was thinking about RoPax and ferries. No, I'm so sorry. No, there is an exemption on all types of ships only until 2030 in the case of EU ETS, and permanent for FuelEU regarding 50% of the energy, and until 2029 for the total energy of voices connecting outermost regions. So yes, sorry, I was mistaken.
Okay, thanks, Marina. Another question here. Considering the example of the voyage with bunkering in Las Palmas,
Yes.
We ask here, understood, if the bunker is made in a non-EU port, the costs of EU ETS would be the same.
Okay, in this case, let me go back. Okay, so in this case, you mean instead of Las Palmas, imagine that it was in Africa?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, in this case, very interesting question. It will be the same cost. Why? Because if we go to the definition of port of call, which is here, it says the stops for the sole purposes of refueling does not qualify of port of call. It doesn't matter where it is located, the port. So, sorry. So in this case, I don't know, but okay. So in this case, even if it was in another port, it won't count as a port of call either way. So it doesn't matter that it is done in Las Palmas or in another port. The thing that it's going to be the same impact. The thing here, what I would highlight the most is, since this type of stops does not qualify as port of calls, if they did qualify, then we will be paying only for this part of the voyage. You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting to consider, isn't it? Because the distance between Las Palmas and Cartagena is bigger than the distance between Rotterdam and Las Palmas. So what would the calculation be there?
And this,
Maybe,
sorry.
yeah. So maybe it would be cheaper to pay 100% from
Yeah,
Rotterdam to Las Palmas than 50% of the whole voyage.
I think it would be interesting to look into it. I don't know, but I'm sure it is. Like, well, I'm not sure. It might be the case.
Yeah, you have to study it.
Yes.
Yeah, if anyone has any more questions in the chat, then please put them through. I was also considering at the end, you were saying that the International Maritime Organization will be studying this in when was the date you said that they would be looking into it? 2026?
Well, in April 2025, they are working on it. However, the European Commission is going to have a revision on the ETS in 2026.
And do you see the International Maritime Organization creating a similar regulation globally, or do you
Yeah.
think this is going to continue to be regional?
No, this is the idea. You are on point, Chris. This is the idea. They are currently working on an economic measure very similar to the ETS. And also, if I remember correctly, another one very similar to the FuelEU. So for the national industry and European industry, this is the objective to be pursued, because at the moment we are losing competitiveness in Europe.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure there'll be studies to see the effect of the competitiveness of European ports as a result of this. And we'll find out about that moving forward, I'm sure. There's another question. Does EU or ANAVE have any database with a list of the bunker suppliers which have certified biofuels?
I don't recall having a list, but this is something that I could look into, because I'm not sure. Not in ANAVE, but maybe at the European level, there will be a list. Yes, maybe.
Yeah, because it's an interesting question on a physical level. In ports, you need the infrastructure in place to be able to support the regulations and to support the owners to try and comply with reducing their emissions. So do you see these new fuel sources being readily available within the time frame that's set out by these regulations?
This is the question.
Yeah.
Okay, if you ask the fuel providers, they will tell you that depends on the demand. And then if you ask the shipping industry, they will tell you that depends on the offer. So it's going back and forth between I mean, I think both of them are ready to collaborate, and trying to really have the readiness. But this is the key question now. We don't know. We don't know how much is going to be available and where is it going to be available.
Yeah, and also not just European ports, because for international voyages,
Yes,
bunkers would need to be taken before arrival into Europe,
yes,
and then it might be more difficult to bunker a renewable fuel source outside of Europe.
yes, you're right. You're right. I suppose that it will create a new demand, so maybe it won't be as difficult, but I mean, we are talking about very regional demand. So again, unknown. This is, I think, a little bit frustrating, but
Yeah.
it's not something that anyone can answer very certainly.
How do Spanish owners at the moment feel in general about the regulations?
I mean, just they have already invested a lot. They are very compromised with the energy transition and reducing emissions. I didn't say it in this slide, but actually we have estimated with our shipping companies that they have already invested 800 millions of euros in the past to reduce their emissions. So there is a compromise there. I think it's not only for shipping companies, but at the European level, what they demand or they hope for is that the funds that are being collected with their economic efforts are useful to support the decarbonization of the industry, whether it is for them, for the renewal of the ships, or for ports, for the port. It's a win-win.
Yeah, and globally, is Europe the most advanced in terms of these regulations? I know you put the figure up of 0.3%. It seems very small compared to the whole world. Are any other communities, any other states applying anything similar across the rest of the world?
Well, if we count UK as not European, they are right now considering applying their own ETS. Again, but okay, if there are a lot of inconsistencies between the European ETS and FuelEU, imagine between another outside non-European ETS and the European one. They won't be aligned, so it's going to be crazy. It's going to be crazy if it goes like this. But I would say Europe is the first one. Maybe there are other ones being developed, but for sure Europe the first one.
So hopefully it would stand as a model for further regulation across other continents and maybe globally. And then that would put European ship owners at an advantage because they're already adapted to the situation.
Yes, that will be very interesting, Chris. I agree with you.
Yep, that would be very good. Well, we're almost at the end now, Marina. I've enjoyed it a lot. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has. Don't know, do you have any final comments before we finish?
Well, just if you feel that you don't understand these regulations or something, is something that has happened to all of us, just sit down a little bit and be aware of the differences. And then I would say that although it may seem frustrating, I think at the end, if we reach an international agreement, it's going to be for the best of humanity. And finally, I think the shipping industry has faced a lot of challenges before. And this one, me as an engineer, I think is going to be a very exciting one regarding the technology and the evolution. So I would say that.
Okay, but thanks a lot, Marina. We'll stay in touch, I'm sure, for further developments. And we hope that the shipping community in general can adapt to it and that these are positive changes moving forwards.
Me too. Me too.
Okay. Thanks everyone for taking part, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Thanks, Marina.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.